Today I'm going to give you some tips on how you can use layering with watercolors and other art materials for your constellation assignment. So I'm going to go ahead and do my constellation with some colored Sharpies. I'm going to use the Sharpies so that the watercolor doesn't smear them. Now that I'm done putting down my constellation patterns with my Sharpies, I'm going to work on adding in the first layer of watercolors. So to do that, you just need your watercolors, your water, and your paintbrush. I'm going to use this bigger paintbrush because it's going to make it a little quicker. So just get some clean water. Maybe start with your yellows first so they don't get dirty. Start with those lighter colors. And just go ahead and add water to all those colors before you get started. It helps soften up the watercolors so it's easy to paint with them. So I'm going to do my first layer of watercolors using two different techniques. For my shapes or my little pictures that I found in my constellation art, I'm going to use just the wet paint on top of the dry paper, making sure I add more water to that so it doesn't dry out. And I'm just gonna lay down kind of a thin layer of color. Since we're layering, it doesn't have to be really bright on your first layer. You can keep it lighter and then go back and add in some darker color as we go along. So this is the way I'm planning to do it. You might have a different plan. But I'm just going to go ahead and use the wet paint on the dry paper to start. You can see the first shapes I painted turned out nice and flat edged because I did those first with a really dry brush and the paper was really dry. And then the ones I did a little bit later after I had finished the different shapes, I let those smear and blend together. So now I'm gonna work on the background, and you can do your background this way if you want to. It's kind of up to you, but I do really like using this technique where I'm gonna paint the water on first so that my paper is wet. Now, if you used a regular marker that's not a Sharpie, the water will smear your marker, but mine's not gonna smear because I used the Sharpie. Now, if you don't have Sharpies, that's okay. Just use what you have. You can use oil pastels or colored pencils. I'm gonna work half my paper at a time so the water doesn't dry. And then I'm gonna use the wet on wet technique where I just use the pure color, and I'm gonna drop that onto the wet paper to get like that nice blended look. I'm gonna set my artwork to the side now and let it dry thoroughly before I do any more layering. Now I'm just gonna show you a few techniques that you can use to add more depth and color and dimension to your watercolors or whatever art medium you're using. So colored pencils actually work really well on top of watercolor paints. So I'm using my sharp colored pencil to shade in a little bit the bird wings, to just kind of give those a little bit more dimension. So don't ever try to do your shading with a dull pencil. It does not work very good. So shading is really easy. I just kind of pick one edge of my shape or my object, and I create a dark area by pressing harder with the colored pencil. And then I just blend that into a softer area, a lighter area. And I can keep going until I've shaded that, making it go from light to dark. Just kind of helps to create some depth in your artwork. Shading is really good if you're trying to make things look a little more realistic, but can also work on abstract art to create forms that suggest things or images to the viewer that's looking at it. So I'm pretty happy with that shading. I did a little bit of shading over here too with a green colored pencil on the bottom of the shoe. It's kind of hard to see with the watercolors, but sometimes even just those subtle details will really make your artwork better. Now you could also use oil pastels. So I'm gonna do some oil pastels on my star because I want my star to stand out a little bit more. I'm gonna use the white, and then I'm gonna paint over this in a moment with some watercolors. So when you go back with other materials on top of your first layer, you're just creating a little more depth, more volume to your artwork, making it more interesting. You can add patterns doing this. You can add shading. And maybe, I think I'm gonna turn this into a butterfly. So I'm gonna do that with my oil pastel. And then maybe I'll paint a few more designs on that butterfly. But I'm just starting with my oil pastel. Okay, Sharpies are great too for this, going back in and adding more dimension to your artwork. So if you have a black Sharpie, that will work. I've kind of tried to keep my assignment colorful. So I'm just gonna go in with my green Sharpie, just add some patterns. Maybe make this look a little more like a shoe. And regular old markers are fine to use as well. This marker's a little dried out, but when you paint over these regular markers, they are going to smear a little bit, but I kind of want to see that effect since I'm trying to create clouds in my artwork. And believe it or not, I think that's the only marker I have. I don't use markers very often, so I need to get some. Use those a little more often. Okay, next I'm just gonna give you one more quick demo with the watercolors just to show you what different effects you can create. I did a little more shading on my bird. He's starting to pop out a little bit better now. And I have some very clean water, and I already wet my watercolors down. Don't forget when you're painting with watercolors that as soon as the water gets cloudy and murky and doesn't look very clean, to go refill it. You don't want to be painting with that dirty water. So I'm just going to show you kind of what happens when you paint over oil pastels, and this will also work with a crayon. This is a wax resist. And so it just kind of adds a little more dimension to my art, but I still want to see that lighter layer underneath. So I'm going to leave a little bit of that showing. So this assignment, I kind of want to see if you can build up some layers on your artwork. You can use any of the techniques I showed you. I kind of left my dot showing there. If you are having trouble and the watercolor is sticking to your oil pastel, or maybe this even works with crayons, but sometimes it doesn't work the best with crayons, you can always take a little tissue or something and dab that off. Okay, another technique you can do with watercolors is just laying down the watercolors and dabbing off a little bit of it with the tissue. I'm just using some tissue paper because it's sitting right here. And that's another way you can create effects with watercolor. So I'm just gonna also try painting some water on top of my markers and seeing if that smears around a little bit the way I wanted it to. It's not really working the way I wanted it to, probably because my marker is kind of old and dried out, but it might work better if I actually try to draw into the water. It's kind of more of the effect I wanted. So there's a couple ways you can do that with the marker in the water. And then don't forget too, you can layer just by adding more watercolors on top of your dry watercolors. So anywhere you want to add some extra pops of color, I'm going to add some to my butterfly here. That was a happy accident, so I'm going to use that to make a symmetrical pattern. You can also just go back in and add layers on top of the painting that you already did.